All right, so there's two parts to the hearing today involving President Trump. Now, this is back in Florida. Remember, earlier we were talking about, in just yesterday, the hearing about whether or not Jack Smith was legitimate was on Friday and yesterday. And that hearing about, because he is not a U.S. attorney who is then given the special counsel role, and because a special counsel is even different than a U.S. attorney because they get almost universal jurisdiction, they still do have to report to the attorney general. The deputy attorney general is usually put in charge of monitoring special counsels. And this has been an issue that's been raised by the right and the left. We talked about it yesterday. But now we're getting more specific into what actually happened at Mar-a-Lago. And this is while Judge Cannon is going to determine whether or not she believes Jack Smith is even a legitimate prosecutor for this case. But what we're looking at is due process violations made. So we talked about initially how they said you got to cut the recording off of the agents going in. And ultimately, that recording was turned back on. But the second part of this was the fact that, again, like during a hearing on Tuesday on classified documents, so some of this is sealed, so no one can be in the hearing room because they're talking about classified documents. But we know that President Trump's team is going to argue that their due process rights were violated when the FBI agents raided the Mar-a-Lago property and that attorney-client privilege was breached. But that hearing is sealed, so there's no members of the press or public will be there. The private hearing will be conducted to protect those classified and attorney-client privilege matters. But the case, and we're going to Harry Hutchinson on this, that they are focusing on first, Harry, and this is something we see often when there's raids and when there's a FBI move to seize documents, is that the warrant to go after the documents was so broad that it lacked the particulars that's required by the Fourth Amendment.
I think that's precisely correct. And so I think the Trump defense is on sound grounds in asserting Trump's constitutional rights grounded in the Fourth Amendment. So the quintessential question is whether Trump's due process rights were violated during the FBI's Mar-a-Lago raid, and secondarily, was the search warrant, which was the predicate for the raid, was that basically a misleading search warrant? In other words, the judge was indeed misled. So based on the publicly available information, I think the answer is yes. I'm not taking a position on how the judge will necessarily rule in this case, but it's important to note that Trump's defense can logically make the claim that the evidence obtained during the search warrant should be thrown out due to unconstitutionality because the warrant lacked, as you point out, Jordan, particularity as required by the Fourth Amendment. What does the Fourth Amendment do? It protects every person from an unreasonable government intrusion. And so, secondly, Trump's lawyers can claim that the special counsel, Jack Smith, does not have standing to invoke, for instance, a good faith exception to preserve the evidence from the search because the agents engaged in bad faith in conducting the search. So we have evidence, for instance, that they turned off the recording. Then we have evidence that the recording was turned on. So why would you turn off the recording? There's no basis for doing so unless you're trying to hide something. And guess what? The recording actually protects both the defendant and the FBI. And so then you could go into court and you could basically say to the judge, we conducted this search, the FBI could, in accordance with constitutional principles. Why don't you look at the tape? Except the FBI is saying, hey, we want to cut off the tape. It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't pass the smell test.
I mean, at one point, you have to wonder if on that tape, because it did start recording again around 10:30 when they were conducted most of the raid, and good on the attorneys for getting that recording back done. But you don't know if every room had the same kind of cameras. A lot of time those cameras are in hallways and entrances to rooms, but they're not in the room itself. And you wonder if there's video of them scattering around and then taking pictures of documents to make it look like Donald Trump left these documents out, kind of willy-nilly in a room. They're kind of scattered and dirty. And, remember the one they took like in a bathroom? Now, even though they were utilizing just an area of Mar-a-Lago that was unused and was actually being sealed up, they made it look like, if he keeps, classified documents near a toilet. That's not the case. It was a whole section of Mar-a-Lago that wasn't being utilized. And it was blocked off from guests to be able to turn into this. So I think, again, that issue alone. They also did something, Harry, which I think as attorneys we're always very concerned about, which is piercing the veil and going to the attorneys. And we've seen that in this case, maybe more in these cases than any other cases in history, where they are going at the attorneys. And at this time, they tried to use the crime fraud exception to go after a Trump attorney, Evan Corcoran. Again, while this is all going on, there in this kind of mess of the raid that that's not timed is going on. And piercing that veil is supposed to be very difficult, but it seems like it's not for the special counsel.
I think that is
They
correct.
go to a judge, they just ask for it, and they get whatever they want.
I think that is correct. And there's no evidence that the crime fraud exception applies to the facts in this particular case. And so one of the things that we have to go back to is we have to go back to Jack Smith's record in prior cases. Jack Smith has a reputation for overcharging defendants, and Jack Smith basically has a history of being overturned by the Supreme Court. So if you look at the McDonald case involving the former governor of Virginia, he was overturned by a unanimous Supreme Court opinion. So one of the things that is going against Jack Smith in this particular case is his prior history. And so I hope the judge scrutinizes his conduct very harshly, if you will, simply because he has a very bad record and a record of bad faith.
We've seen throughout this entire case, starting with the actual raid itself, the unprecedented nature in which the Department of Justice, the FBI, and now the Special Counsel's Office has been behaving. On one hand, they try to explain away the boilerplate language of use of deadly force in the search warrant language, and then said, we didn't really see a threat. And then on the other hand, they're trying to turn off CCTV cameras because of the security and safety of the agents. There's so many different issues, whether it be what Judge Cannon raised yesterday with the post-due financial report that they're supposed to be given, that they say, well, we've got it done, but it's going through review. And she replies with, well, we're in June now. And they haven't had a report since late last year.
Back was it, don't worry, if you don't like us getting money this way, we're definitely going to prosecute this case. We can get money. We're the Department of Justice. We got plenty of money. And the idea that they could be so flippant about that, she said, is also unnerving because you're putting a defense when you feel like the weight of the government's coming at you, Harry, and they go into court and say, we've got unlimited resources to prosecute you. We don't care if this judge thinks the way we're getting the resources is wrong. We know we could go to the Department of Justice and get $20 billion more this way. I mean, if you're a defendant or the defense counsel, you realize what you're up against is this unbelievable wall of resources.
I think that is correct. And it's very, very important to keep in mind that the security of the agents in this case, as Will points out, is secondary to the constitutional rights of the defendant in this case. And so one of the things that is very imperative for listeners to keep in mind is, yes, the special counsel may have access to unlimited resources, but if he is using unlimited resources to prosecute an infirm case. In other words, a case that doesn't make sense legally, it doesn't matter. And so the judge needs to cut off the FBI and needs to cut off Jack Smith. And there's an argument out there that Jack Smith should indeed ultimately be removed from this case.
It was done in August of 2022. We're now in 2024. And, we're getting closer and closer to where you realize, again, that they haven't even gotten through the procedural grounds of this. And this is probably one of the most serious cases, but because it involves classified documents, it has taken a long time. And there's also the look at whether or not Jack Smith is even been legitimately appointed. I think Jack Smith is facing a lot more pushback from the courts, not just Judge Cannon,